Hello, everyone. We are so happy to have you here today for Senator Gonzalez's legislative briefing on AI and automated decision-making systems. We have convened experts from the legislature, from advocacy, from academia to help us understand these technologies, what their risks are, and what we as legislators can do to address some of these risks. One note as the panel proceeds, as you have questions, please add them to the chat so that we can raise them to the panel in Q&A. And without further ado, I am so pleased to introduce Senator Kristen Gonzalez. Senator Kristen Gonzalez represents a 59th Senate District, which covers parts of Manhattan, Queens, and Brooklyn. Senator Gonzalez is the chair of the Internet and Technology Committee in the Senate. And in this year's budget, Senator Gonzalez passed the New York Fair Act, which makes New York one of the safest jurisdictions in the country against deceptive deepfakes for elections. Senator Gonzalez, I give it to you to take it away.
Thank you so much, Elon. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I am really grateful to the panelists for taking the time to do this legislative briefing, especially because AI and the existential, risks, but also promises that it poses is an incredibly important topic and one that's been coming up a ton this legislative session. So, we often hear about AI in the context of talking about its capabilities, but today's discussion is going to focus more on the suitability of AI and automated decision-making tools. And our office has been focusing on this, especially with our bill called the Loading Act, which we're sponsoring alongside Assemblymember Otis. And with that, I'm going to actually introduce our panelists today, starting with the Assemblymember. So Assemblymember Otis represents the 91st Assembly District, which covers Eastern Westchester County. Assemblymember Otis is the chair of the Science and Technology Committee in the Assembly, and he has won impressive accomplishments advancing digital inclusion in the state and has a commitment to making technology accessible and safe for New Yorkers. We're honored to have the Assemblymember join us today. Next, we have Albert Fox Cahn, who is the founder and executive director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. He is also the practitioner in residence at NYU Law School's Information Law Institute and a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. Albert's comments on the dangers of surveillance have been published in prominent outlets, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, and Wired. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Zephyr Teachout with us today, who is a law professor at Fordham Law School, where she teaches corporations, election law, antitrust, and white-collar criminal law, focusing on the intersection of corporate power and political power. Zephyr has a demonstrated commitment to New York state government, including a 2021 appointment as special advisor and senior counsel for economic justice at the New York Attorney General's office. So thank you all so much. Incredibly impressive panel that we have today. And as we get started, I just wanted to contextualize the conversation with how we're defining artificial intelligence. So we have different types of artificial intelligence, of course. And one type, we've been using and has been around the term for the last 50 years, right? So automated decision-making systems are systems that, again, we engage with every day. And then we have new types of AI. So we have generative AI and large language models. Our bill is focused on not only focusing on automated decision-making systems, but setting a clear standard going forward. And one analogy I like to offer when we talk about this in the legislature is that AI is a lot like a car, especially generative AI. It's something that can get us to some really cool places, has some cool functionality, but as a society, we haven't built the roads or the stop signs or created the traffic law to use that car in a responsible way. And as legislators, it's our role to build that infrastructure and maintain that infrastructure to make sure that, again, especially as a state government, we're using AI in a responsible way. So that's why we've introduced the Loading Act. And before we get into our discussion, I wanted to turn it to Assemblymember Otis to present a bit on what that bill does and why it's important. So I'll turn it to you, Assemblymember.
Great, Kristen, and great to be part of this panel. And I would just say at the outset, Senator Gonzalez and I chair equivalent committees in each house, and we have a very good working relationship and trying to move a complicated agenda. It is, I think, one of the barriers within all legislatures is to get other legislators to understand the nuance and the detail on some of these emerging technology issues, many of which present threats to individual rights and harms in a whole variety of ways. And you're talking in a sphere where people don't fully even understand what we're talking about is sort of part of the barriers. But the Loading Act is really our attempt to put some rails in as it relates to governmental use, state governmental use of automated decision-making. And so we have some slides that I think are going to get tossed up on the screen that we'll go through quickly, but I'm not one for reading from slides. I'm not going to read from slides, but I'll give you the themes. And if the slides don't come up, we'll do it anyway. Here are the themes for the Loading Act. The Loading Act basically makes a difference between different kinds of automated decision-making, high risk, low risk, things that are consequential for individuals and things that are more mundane, and make some differentiation which makes some sense. The second major theme is that there's an impact assessment that we're going to ask state agencies to do and to report to the legislature and report to the governor in terms of kinds of automated decision-making tools they may consider using, and set up a process to make that happen. And here we got slide number.
Apologies. I think it's funny, we're chairs of technology, and I at least constantly have tech issues. So we're going to do it this way.
So here is slide number 1. And what you see here are the bill numbers, which are 7543 in the Senate, 9430. But as I say, we're here to provide some protections from government use of these technologies in ways that would be harmful. And so we can go to the second slide. Again, risk-based. Here's the impact assessment. And you see on here some of the kinds of things that would be part of the impact assessment that we're asking state agencies to utilize in terms of going forward before using these kinds of techniques. And then if we can go to the third screen, important to note that if we really would like to see meaningful human oversight, human involvement, don't farm the whole thing out to these technologies. And so that's one way that agencies can use these tools, but not totally hand off to them. I would say more broadly, the challenge here, and we have some great academic speakers that are going to follow us here and can speak at length about this. But as it relates to AI in the use of government, but even in the private sector, I think that one of the emerging areas that we have to be concerned about is the nexus between data privacy, individual information, which in a sense, AI has an appetite for data. And so if we didn't have enough problems with surveillance and data being taken from us in all circumstances, AI is actually raising the incentive for this data harvesting and these privacy threats. So I'm eager to hear from our two academic speakers, not just about the importance of doing bills in New York and in other states and federally to put guardrails down for government, but also more broadly, this apparent but emerging increased threat to privacy as it relates to the expanded desire to use AI. And I hope that's seductive enough to give our next speakers plenty to talk about.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. And I guess with that, we want to turn it over to our speakers to share their thoughts on why this is an important issue. And so I'm going to turn it first to Albert Fox Cahn.
Well, thank you so much for having me here today. This could not be more timely because we're facing a AI governance crisis, not just in the United States, but around the world as countries really struggle to figure out how to create safeguards against the use of technologies that are increasingly making life-altering decisions about all of us. And actually, maybe we could take the slides down for this part. And when we look at the framework for AI accountability, it really is a Kafka situation. I'll give an example. New York State Police Department uses facial recognition thousands of times a year. And, back in 2020, my organization, Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, submitted a FOIL request for information about the accuracy and bias of that facial recognition system. If you're using this to make arrests, if you're using this to prosecute cases, this seems like some of the most basic information that you could have. But the NYPD not only refused to provide those documents, they said under oath they didn't have any documents that went to the accuracy or the bias of the technology. And so, let's just pause with just how momentous that is. That thousands of New Yorkers have been arrested on the basis of an automated decision system whose accuracy and bias was never investigated, was never substantiated, with an unknown likelihood of false arrest as a result. And this coming with a technology where we've seen around the country that nearly every time facial recognition has been investigated by academics, by NIST, by federal regulators, they have found systemic bias, particularly against BIPOC individuals and particularly against Black women. And so when we are talking about these AI risks, it can seem very amorphous and it can seem very academic, but the real life impact on New Yorkers every day means being wrongly arrested. It means being denied a job. It means being denied public benefits. It means being, shut out of public education that you're entitled to. It really could not be more significant. Um, at STOP, we've noticed a couple of issues with the way that a lot of jurisdictions around the country approach the AI debate, and it's really exciting to see sort of a different approach being imagined here and sort of a much more aggressive one. Well, first off, a lot of jurisdictions have sort of been tangled up in this question about what counts as AI, what counts as automated decision systems. And I think it's really important at the outset to keep in mind that this will change, right? When you are legislating against a moving target. And so in creating a response, you need to have a measure of artificial intelligence that talks about what are the latest and greatest tools being marketed to all of us, whether they're generative AI or large language models, but also is going to capture whatever is cutting edge in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. We have historically in the United States failed to draft legislation that keeps up with the curve of innovation as it pushes forward. And so with the Loading Act, with other measures that we've been supporting, we think there's a real opportunity to go with something broader that isn't just locked in to a specific form of machine learning. Because I promise you, as soon as you agree on a definition for machine learning, it will have changed. And that really is crucial. Another thing that's really important here is to take a step back from some of the existential threats that we hear about in the news. I mean, a lot of us saw Terminator. A lot of us saw these sci-fi movies where, general AI was taking over and posed an existential threat to humanity. And we've seen a lot of focus from, lawmakers at the federal level about those long-term threats. But this ignores the ways that AI is driving bias and discrimination error on a massive level today. And so this real need to look at every facet of automated decision systems within the state that create a risk of truly harming the public. And, as we go into this process, we should keep in mind that, some of the most far-reaching automated decision system errors in the past, they've been formulas in Excel. They've been very crude mathematical products that tried to streamline processes that impacted thousands, millions of people. And as a result, we saw a lot of people getting hurt. Examples of this are, if we look at in the United Kingdom, they had a massive scandal about accounting software that had tried to automate a lot of the fraud detection for the postal system there. And it led to thousands of people being wrongly accused of fraud, many going to jail, many losing their livelihoods, some losing their lives because of software that was glitching. We've similarly seen issues with Michigan-based public benefit software, which because of errors in the automated decision system led to just thousands of people being wrongly denied benefits and wrongly accused of fraud and targeted with criminal prosecution in some cases because of the underlying errors in ADS. And part of why legislation is so crucial is a lot of the traditional mechanisms for accountability don't work in the system. Not only do we see issues with freedom of information compliance today with many of the automated decision systems used around New York State, we also see a catch-22 when it comes to litigating against the use of these systems. I'm a litigator. I always believe that the courts have a indispensable role in holding, companies and agencies accountable when they do harm. And today it's almost impossible as a litigator to take a company, to take an agency into court and to accuse them of violating existing human rights laws, existing civil rights laws, when they're using automated decision systems, because all too often as a member of the public you cannot prove the facts that you need in order to survive a motion to dismiss in order to move forward with the case. And so the more proactive we are with these auditing requirements, and hopefully there will be additional measures going forward that address some of the needs in civil procedure reform, that these will create a pathway to really hold agencies and companies accountable when they've used automated decision systems or AI in a harmful way. Because, in my past life, I was a corporate attorney. And if I were a corporate attorney advising a company or an agency today, I would say, put all of your riskiest, most problematic decisions inside of artificial intelligence products, inside of automated decision systems, not because they'll do a good job, but because it'll make it almost impossible for you to get sued, because it creates that black box to mask harmful decisions, the sorts of decisions we would never have any qualms about targeting if engaged in by a human being. I should note that a discussion about automated decision systems and AI would not be complete without talking about some of the broader issues with biometric privacy and artificial intelligence. To speak to the Assemblymember's point, AI is driving surveillance on a massive scale, and one of the key forms of that is biometric surveillance that previously was not possible without the sort of computational power we have today. And that doesn't just mean facial recognition. That means, tracking nearly every part of your body and turning it into an identification tool, whether it's your iris scan, your fingerprint, or even the way you walk, even your voice pattern. Every part of your body can be transformed by these invasive, data scraped fed products in order to identify you and in order to just chisel away a bit more of your privacy. I could be on a soapbox about this all day, but I know we've got a number of points to cover, so I think I'll pause there, but really looking forward to your questions and just really excited that we're diving into this subject.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Albert. And reminder for anyone, if they have questions, there's a Q&A function, so we can get to those in the second half of the call. But without further ado, I want to turn it over to the incredible Zephyr Teachout for her comments as well.
Thank you so much for having me and for really pushing New York to move quickly in this area. I want to do two things in this brief time. One is to talk about the particular discriminatory harms that we're talking about, and the second is to talk about law and how these laws fit into a long tradition of anti-discrimination laws. So I think it's helpful at first to think about the AI, the algorithmic AI that most of us are pretty familiar with. If you are on Instagram, for instance, one of the major thing that Meta, the company that owns Instagram, is doing is basically making a very detailed portrait of you, taking your mood as judged by how quickly you type, your location, the length of time you spend looking at a particular video, your friend network, different videos that you have liked or not liked, thousands, not hundreds of thousands of little pieces of information about you, and basically making a mathematical model, and then taking that mathematical model of you, as somebody, Tristan Harris says, it's like creating a voodoo doll, of this little mathematical version of you, and deciding, in the case of Instagram, what content it could deliver to you that would make you the most likely to stay on the site. There's other functions, but let's take the simplest function, right? So then it's assessing billions of pieces of content and trying to match at that moment with this mathematical model of you. That's what Instagram is doing. What we already know is that use, very simple use of AI, but it's something that requires AI to function, has deeply discriminatory impacts. In some ways, you could say that the design is discrimination understood broadly. There's certain parts of discrimination that are illegal, but discrimination being treating people differently than each other is actually the core thing that Instagram or TikTok or YouTube is doing, treating each person differently based on a map of themselves and mapping it with these billion pieces of data. And in that social media realm, the impacts include really different treatment of by people depending on their race, location, social status. There is a discriminatory impact even when the data points used are themselves not in the protected class. Okay, now let's apply that to other areas. This is also the basic business model used for deciding how much you pay for an Uber drive. We're still in the private sector here. And so Uber then also makes a mathematical portrait of you and of the driver and identifies, oh, how little can we pay the driver and how much are you willing to pay? There's reporting, which Uber denies, that it actually charges more for people based on assessing that their phone battery is low, that people with low phone batteries are likely to be charged more for an Uber drive. That's a little data point used to deliver the price. Uber denies it, but it isn't against the law at this point to do that. So it's an example of what is currently allowed. What happens when that moves into government? And so I want to talk about this because I think, broadly speaking, there is a real challenge at this moment when you have a technology that is based on first-degree discrimination, basically treating each person differently, becoming the business model of society, affecting how people have personalized wages, maybe based on how desperate they are, or personalized prices. You pay more for ketchup because I know that you need to get home by 3 to pick up your kid. These kinds of data points. Today, we're not talking about those broadly, although those are very much on the horizon. But what happens when you apply a algorithmic AI regime to government? So take the simplest model. If I go to the health department right now, I get a pretty flat web page. But as far as I can tell, nothing in existing law would prohibit the New York State Health Department from using the same technology that I just described that Instagram uses. And it might do so because administrators want to make sure people get the information they most want, right? It might come from a good place. We need to make sure we match the information about breast cancer with those people who need information about breast cancer. But once they use that targeting mechanism, you are in many, many instances going to see very significant discriminatory effects. And while there's real dangers in discriminatory effects in society at large, there's something uniquely wrong about government, where equality is the core commitment, that each of us come as equals to the Department of Health, the Department of Education, the police department, something uniquely troubling about technology that has a very significant risk of discriminatory impact on the basis of race, color, religion, ethnicity, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, all of these already protected classes. This is not a small concern. Embedded in the technology is our discriminatory tools that can then have very significant impacts on who gets information about what health services, who gets information about what opportunities to take out a loan in the financial realm, who gets information about any number of possibilities in the Department of Ed. So that's even the simplest model, a really basic, and this bill and this move would quickly move to say we as a state are committed to equality in our interactions with our citizens. And without that, we can't make that commitment because, as was said, we don't actually know. And well-meaning public servants can turn to these extraordinary tools and end up using them in really profoundly discriminatory ways. What we know from other states, although it's still a black box, is algorithmic AI was used to sort and create school placements. I have a 5.5-year-old, you know, parents, you know, the level of anxiety and paranoia around schools. Adding algorithmic AI to something so important in a child's life that has, using tools that have profound discrimination built into them. Again, even if you take out, even if the AI is not using individual data about race, religion, gender, or other protected classes, the fact that it is a tool built on personalization creates extraordinary risk of bias and differential treatment. So this move towards requiring that our state, in all its functions, not engage in, not use tools. First of all, know what tools are being used, and then not use tools that that operate with bias, I think is really essential. The second thing I just wanted to touch on is that this is, in some ways, and I think there's some indication of this, a really modest first step, and an essential first step, but it is not an unusual one. In the history of every major technology, one of the most significant moments has been a move towards non-discrimination rules. And the non-discrimination rules are different in different technologies. So in railroads, the first big legislation was non-discrimination legislation in the 1880s, sorry. Basically saying railroads can't discriminate between different people. But we have non-discrimination legislation that moved into telegraph, telephone, healthcare. Far too late non-discrimination legislation in housing. 30 years after the federal government aggressively went out and profiled neighborhoods. You want to talk about early targeting, the early, what we now think of as redlining, came from color coding neighborhoods based on race-based data that has had a 100-year history in impacting the ability of Black and Brown New Yorkers to get loans. So the danger of using profiling technology isn't just a short term, it's a long term. And then many years later, finally passed the Fair Housing Act, a sort of key non-discrimination rule. So I think it's important to understand that all powerful technologies need non-discrimination provisions in order to actually serve human flourishing instead of exploitation ends. So excited to be here and excited to engage in further conversation. Thank you.
Deeply appreciate it, Zephyr and Albert, for all of your thoughtful comments. I have so many thoughts. I know more than anything, though, there's a lot of work to be done here. And as you both mentioned, especially in this moment, a lot of urgency. I think a couple of points I wanted to relate back to the legislation that we're working on is, a lot of current bills around government use of artificial intelligence or private sector use of artificial intelligence fall within a risk-based approach. And we've seen that risk-based approach applied to federal legislation. I think one of you had mentioned NIST, there's these agencies that also set those standards. Same thing in other countries as well. We see the approach of the EU. But one thing we've been asking ourselves a lot are, what are
Big brother shut you off, Senator.
This is the
So it's not just
danger.
me, she's frozen for all of
Yeah,
us.
yes,
Okay.
this is the danger of relying on the technology we seek to combat. Maybe Assemblymember, do you want to
Well,
pick up the baton?
Well, I think what I would suggest is for either of you, if you would like to comment on what the senator sort of opened up with, I think you saw where she was going. So I give the floor to either of you to follow up on that.
Zephyr, would you like to?
Assemblymember, unlike maybe some of the tools we're talking about, I can't actually predict exactly where she was going. So, and neither can the tools.
I can ask a different question then. How's that?
I do have,
Which is, embedded in both of your comments were a question that seems very apparent to me, which is whether it's a private sector entity or a governmental entity. Many of the folks using these technologies don't even understand what they have.
No.
And so they may not even have been, in a sense, they may be buying a product from somebody and not understand the biases and harms that are embedded in those products. So both of you can chime in and sort of give from your work in this field what you're seeing in that space.
Yeah, all too often those who are buying these products on behalf of agencies are being sold a bill of goods. They're being, told that these technologies are a magic elixir that will cure all of our ills and will, solve everything from the achievement gap to, massive budget overruns for some agencies and everything in between. And we have to acknowledge that while these technologies can be very powerful for certain purposes, there's often a fundamental mismatch between what they're actually capable of doing effectively and the requirements that agencies have to actually make life better for New Yorkers. So let's take the recent example of chatbots where we were talking about this before the session started, how because of all of the focus on chatbots, Mayor Adams made this rollout of a citywide chatbot a priority. And very quickly afterwards, the researchers at the markup found out that it was not only making errors, but it was advising New Yorkers to break the law. And here was an example of a technology that chatbots can be great, but they aren't a suitable replacement for the 311 system. And similarly, we saw a significant investment from the city in creating deep fakes of the mayor to make calls in different languages, where we have incredible native speakers of many languages around New York City who are hired to make these calls normally. And the technology was actually not very good at doing the translation or the deepfake. So whenever we're being sold these technologies, we have to look at the potential bias, we have to look at the potential of error. But as a predicate, one thing we just aren't structurally asking is, is this an investment in something that actually needs to be fixed? And I assure you that as we see more of the products that have been deployed, more often than not, the answer will clearly have been no.
I think sometimes about just to sort of do a little thought experiment about judges. If I said, okay, we can clear off the docket. We can really move through the docket fast if we turn over, judicial decisions to AI systems. And I use that because I think all have the instinct that that's deeply wrong, that there's a sacred trust between the public and those who come into court. That there will be a flawed human, but a human who brings their own, who listens, who cares, who goes through the work. And so often we are focused on getting through the docket. And so, yes, the docket would move faster, but there would be significant bias and we would not have fulfilled our basic obligation. A lot of decisions that a state makes may not be as dramatic or as dramatized as a courtroom, but are as significant, whether that's in the criminal law context or in the welfare context or in the provision of any kind of benefit, schools, health, loans. And so understanding that getting through the docket is not the job of the state. The job of the state is fairness, fully hearing all the facts. And there is not room in the state for that, 1%, 3% error rate. That may sound trivial, but is not trivial and really is a fundamental dereliction of the state's obligation. So I'm sympathetic, and I think this is part of what you're getting at, Assemblymember. I'm sympathetic for really overworked, extraordinary public servants who see this potential and think that maybe this could, actually serve more people, right? That just to be really sympathetic here. But it is the wrong answer to have an automated system relying on AI and billions of pieces of data to make these really fundamental decisions about the way a state interacts with a person.
And I really do think this is nothing short of a question about what is the nature of our democracy. What does it look like in the power relationship between New Yorkers and the agencies that are supposed to serve them? And when you have these decisions made, even when they're right, if they're made in an opaque way, in a non-redressable way, in a way that is not readily understood by the New Yorkers who are being impacted, even when that decision is the quote unquote right outcome, it is going to really hollow out some of the basic, fundamentals of what makes a democracy work and makes us really feel like this is not an arbitrary system, but something that, is, accountable to the people of New York.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. Also, apologies. I'm on talking about technology today. I'm on the Senate Wi-Fi and it dropped. So we're also working in this committee on universal broadband, but quality of our internet and our Wi-Fi. So appreciate the additional comments. And I wanted to actually speak to what Albert was just talking about with this being a question about democracy. I'm not sure where I dropped off, but what I was talking about before is we do want to ensure that we're preserving our fundamental rights and having a rights-based approach when we legislate around artificial intelligence. And it should be a right that our government gives us accurate information, right? Or doesn't implement tools that tell us to break the law. And I think, that to speak to the My City chatbot example, and that was part of the impetus of this bill. We have a right to know when and where and how our government is using automated decision-making systems that impact our lives. And we also want to know if we're implementing new tools that are based on generative AI, which does pose significant risk, again, how and where they're being implemented, and that they'll have consistent impact assessments, right, to mitigate any or eliminate any bias. We have a right to know, that if one of these tools, whether it's an ADS or an AI-based tool, is making a decision that deeply impacts our lives, that we find to be inaccurate, that there is human review, right? That we have a right to have someone work with us, and that our government's willing to actually be responsive and accountable for those decisions. And I think that's why for us, it's been so important this session to start with, again, our elections bill, because of the scale of misinformation we're already seeing and the potential, I guess, ramp up of more information now that we have large language models influencing our elections. And then now, second, working on government use of artificial intelligence. And I saw a question in the chat earlier, the difference between public sector regulation versus private sector regulation. Well, we're starting right at home as a state government, again, elections and how we're using it, but that, of course, will continue the work to looking at how the private sector are using these tools and what the fundamental rights for workers will look like, and how we need to work, in partnership with the private sector to pass legislation that, works for the public, but also works for some of the use cases they're trying to solve for. So, just to look at the reasoning why we started here and where we're going in the future. But I wanted to ask folks, in the room right now, for all of the people who are watching, who want to learn more about this, I'm curious, do you have any sources? Do you have, how would we recommend, the average New Yorker learn more about this technology, the risks it poses, and what our government is doing?
I would say there is an incredible wealth of scholarship on a lot of these issues. Ruha Benjamin at Princeton has written a ton about the intersection of, computing, AI, and racism, and the structural drivers of inequity and failure in a lot of these technologies. Meredith Broussard, who's based at NYU, has done incredible writing on a lot of these issues as well. And I think we'll definitely, I feel like I flunked as a teacher because I didn't bring a book list, but we'll be able to send some recommended readings on this as well. But luckily, we may not have a lot of role models on these issues that we can look to in the US, but we have a lot of role models across the world who are tackling these exact same issues, and looking to Europe and some of the approaches that are being taken there is also deeply instructive. So one of my pet passions is the wonky area of civil procedure and artificial intelligence, and sort of looking at the ways that we can address the asymmetry we see between suing people for AI harms and suing them for human harms. And so one thing that I'm just constantly on my soapbox sending to folks is the EU liability directive, which was this this amazing proposal to say that when you're using AI, you should bear the burden of showing that your AI tool was operating lawfully. Because without that sort of shift in the burden of proof, the burden of persuasion, all too often it's going to be impossible to actually have a day in court when you're harmed by AI. But I'll have some folks add additional readings in the chat as well.
If you think you're a bad professor, this is my job, and I didn't bring reading. But I wanted to comment on three things. First, just to really underline what the senator was saying, and I think this connects to the readings question about rights. An essential part of the rule of law that I've talked about a few times already is equality under the law. You do not need to be an AI expert to understand or to feel like you have read everything to demand equal treatment when you interact with the state. That is just a foundational, that is what makes law law. A second part, which relates to what Albert was saying, a second essential feature of the rule of law, and we fail at this all the time, but we've got to seek it, is legibility. Is to know why we require judges to actually explain their decisions. We require not just, well, looks right, but an actual, or that technology is smarter than all my friends put together, but actual explanation for why state decisions were made. And that is why a lot of AI is going to be incompatible with the state in a way that, you know, I have a lot of things that I think we need to be doing in the private sector, and I'm very eager to hear those questions. But I think there is something really unique about the state. And the third thing is, we don't have the books because the black box is still closed. So the stories that we want to tell you about what is happening in state government, the great question, how does recruitment work? This is a question in the chat. How does recruitment work in New York state government? Is AI being used in recruiting in state government? I don't know. And I don't have to know until this law is passed. Right? So we actually need to open the box to be able to tell the stories about what is happening. And we are going to find things that none of us imagined. So there's these few horror stories that we can tell about people being defamed by chatbots. Really, you know, when there's a lie told about somebody, it's not a small thing. It's a fundamental attack on their credibility. Somebody losing a benefit, that is not a small thing. That affects their entire life. But we don't know all the stories and where it is being used right now because we don't have this law passed. So there's a chicken and egg problem. Not quite chicken and egg. We know which is the chicken and which is the egg. We got to crack the egg to see the chicken on this one. Those stories have yet to be written. And I think then they will lead to, my guess is there are areas where it is going to be appropriate, but the idea that the default is that a tool that is based on using individual data to deliver content and has a high risk of bias and a high risk of hallucinations, just falseness, is default acceptable. That cannot be what a state does. That's totally unacceptable for what a state does in terms of its commitments to its citizens.
And I'll just add that wherever we have seen behind the curtain, we've seen a lot of things that are on fire. And so that's part of why it's so urgent to be able to look in even more places.
Can I just add on to the black box analogy? And Albert, in your opening comments, you touched on this as well. Speak, if you could, either of you comment on the limitations of the ability of the audit tools to even discern the biases that people would want to seek remedies for. I think there's the algorithms are actually more robust than the ability to audit the algorithms, but both of you would have more detail on that than I can provide. Please share.
Well, one of my big fears with auditing is that we talk about auditing and it sounds like a financial audit, but imagine a financial audit in a world where you don't have, a tax code, let alone, GAAP accounting standards, right? We have this moment where there are a lot of different computational techniques that can be used to look at different aspects of how different AI systems fail. Right. And we know that a good faith actor operating with the right intent can use an audit tool to identify certain types of failures. But what we cannot do is say that there is one audit tool that will identify all of the ways that these systems can fail algorithmically, let alone all of the ways that they can fail when they're interconnected with all of these other human systems. So take, for example, facial recognition with the police. We know that some of those facial recognition algorithms are 100 times more likely to have an error for a Black woman than for a middle-aged white man like myself. But then what we don't have as part of that is an analysis of, well, how is that error being compounded by discrimination in whose face goes in the facial recognition database in the first place? In New York, it's only mugshots that are used and pistol licenses. So people from over-police communities are more at risk of false arrest. We don't have any analysis of how human decision-making in that facial recognition tool further compound things. So for example, in New York, you will Photoshop crime scene images before running them through a facial recognition algorithm. And none of that has been studied. And I could literally give you dozens of variables like that for just one system that would have to be audited, have to be analyzed before we could ever say, this is a technology where we understand how much more of a risk it is for a Black woman whose photo is being run through facial recognition than for a white man. And so it gets even worse because with some of the weaker audit bills we've seen around the country, it leaves it up to companies to choose their own auditors. And if we learned anything from Enron, if we learned anything from, the financial collapse before, it's when you let people pick their own auditors, there's going to be a race to the bottom to pick the auditor who tells you that no matter what you're doing, that everything's okay. And so when we look at auditing, we have to look at it in this framework as a tool that can be leveraged by the right actor with the right incentives, looking at a narrow part of the problem, but it can never be the magical solution to dismantling all the ways that AI can go wrong.
Yeah, that times 100. It's a false. There's a false promise there, and it's excuse me, sorry. It's a dangerous false promise because it's and Albert sort of alluded to this earlier. There's a lot of talk about the apocalypse coming and focus there, but there's harms happening right now. There's harms happening to New Yorkers who do not know that they are interacting with AI in the distribution of whether it's benefits or profiling. And the more that we focus on the harms and say, we don't accept bias in our system, we just don't accept it. Not a 1% bias. I think that is a much stronger way to go. And so the focus in the LOAD Act on looking at outcomes, if I'm understanding the law right, and we haven't had a chance to talk about it, but I've taken a look at it and it looks great. But sort of looking at bias outcomes, looking at disparate outcomes is really critical, so that you don't get into a fight around the sort of endless hunt of the audit. Also, they're changing the AI all the time. So you're auditing yesterday's or the day before's, and it's sort of in a constant, if you want to say, let's just imagine auditing Uber's AI, for instance. Which one, which day? We changed it yesterday. As opposed to saying, we don't accept this form of differential treatment. Again, I think that's true in the private sector as well. And then I think there's a lot of room to say these are areas where we will not accept differential treatment. You can't use this data for anything. On the one hand, sort of the privacy focus, desperation data, being low on your phone charge being low or your bank account being low. We're not talking about that in these bills, but that seems like the wrong way to figure out somebody's wage, right? Nobody's wage should be determined by their desperation. That's an element of kind of discrimination we shouldn't allow that isn't currently captured in our non-discrimination laws. But when the state's acting, the default has to be, we're treating you all the same.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Again, I feel like this is the first of many events, and we could be here talking and unpacking all of this for quite some time, because these are real challenges. We're part of a work group with legislators across the country, and who is doing the auditing, frequency of auditing, what does an impact assessment even mean? All of these are questions that no one has a definitive answer to, because we're all collectively trying to understand, again, what the risks are and what exactly the best way or to approach this from a legislative perspective and a state perspective. Because again, while there are federal bills, we don't know for sure that they'll end up passing. So it's being left to every state and creating a patchwork of approaches. So we are asking these questions collectively. We're trying to understand. And then to Albert's point earlier, even definitions are difficult when you have such a rapidly developing technology. But I'm really excited about the way that we've crafted our bill to kind of leave for space for growth, right? And again, a bill that says we understand we're going to keep on implementing these tools, but that's why everyone deserves to know where and how and why, and what agencies are using them, and that there are clear standards to onboarding those tools, and reject the notion that bias is just a part of the process or a byproduct of having these tools. Because again, we need to trust our government. We need the highest possible quality of tools and highest possible quality of information that's being distributed, right, on behalf of the government to the public. So very much in line with what you both were saying. I did see the question on recruitment as well in the chat, and I wanted to say for Assemblymember Alvarez, invite you to our roundtable tomorrow at 10 a.m. Right here in the LOB Legislative Office Building 816. It'll also be virtual for those who are not in Albany and joining, where we'll be talking about the impact of AI on the economy and workforce development, and that'll include workforce in New York State. So that'll speak to some of your recruitment questions. But I know we have a few minutes left, so I wanted to thank you all and then also open it up to final thoughts and comments before we wrap up. I don't know, or Albert, yeah, feel free.
I was just gonna say, I look at this as through a historical lens where I see such an analogy to the Industrial Revolution, right? When we first had mass industrial manufacturing in the US, we had all of these antiquated legal rules that said when you hurt someone, there are all these circumstances where you didn't actually have to pay a price, right? And it was members of the public who were the ones bearing that burden when things went wrong. We had this thing called privity of contract, this outdated idea that, well, if you bought something from the store and the store bought it from the manufacturer, you couldn't sue the manufacturer when the wheels came off or when the boiler exploded. Justice Cardozo got rid of that, 108 years ago. He said, no, when the public is injured, the public has to have a way to sue, has to have a way to be made whole. And, when we think about AI, the most fundamental question is, who is going to bear the price when we get these things wrong? Whether it's agencies, whether it's the private sector, is it New Yorkers who are bearing the burden when AI discriminates or when AI is broken? Or is it the manufacturers and the agencies? Because until we actually enact new legislation, it'll continue to be New Yorkers who have to bear that burden.
I have two final thoughts. And again, thank you for your work on this. One is specific to what you're doing now, and the other is to this moment in history, sort of referring also to the Industrial Revolution. The specific thing is, I think states are really critical right now. That states both have the capacity, and New York has the capacity to pass laws and to do things that will really matter, that we see, can be harder at the federal government level. And also it's reclaiming, part of states doing it is reclaiming this as a core question of governance, and also of consumer protection and protecting our economy. So I know that there's going to be a lot of pushback. We've all heard it, and if you're listening, this is too big a problem. We have to deal with this globally. It is actually the tradition of state governments to be on the front line and to help pave the way for learning for what we can do at the federal level. So it's very exciting to see the work that you're doing here. And the second, a little more troubling, is the way in which this seems to me to be also like the Industrial Revolution, is that and I've alluded to this a few times, but we are potentially facing an economy based on what economists call first-degree price discrimination or personalization, or everybody gets a different wage, everybody gets a different price, everybody gets a different experience on social media. Think of it as TikTok, but for everything. And I sometimes think of that as isolation nation or discrimination nation, that it is it has crept up on us in little sectors. Like in Uber, we're used to the idea of different wages, or in other areas. But I think really confronting the areas where we do and do not want to allow differential treatment is important, because it's an economic issue, it's a rights issue, but it's also, and relatedly, it's a democracy issue, because the bazaar may be a nice sort of memory of everything's haggled on individually, but the truth is the least powerful will lose in systems where massive collections of data can identify and differentially treat people. And so it's important to have a public space for markets, a public space for labor, a public space where we are not treated differently. And I guess the provocation is that in some ways, the value proposition of some of AI is everybody's going to get personalized. Everybody's going to get something personalized, and it's exciting. And we've all had those moments of magic. Maybe you haven't, but of seeing the magic of AI. But I think we need some real collective thinking about areas where we do not allow discrimination, moving beyond the 20th century bargain on what can and cannot be discriminated against. I'm really excited that you guys are starting this conversation and bringing such a wonderful set of legislation to the floor.
Thank you so much. And Assemblymember Otis, do you have final words, thoughts before we wrap up?
Two brief comments, and I thank Albert and Zephyr for their great contributions and their work. Two things. Number one, historically, we're going to have AI all around the world. The question is, are we going to have protections for individuals, protections for democracy, or is it just going to be a free-for-all? Is it going to be chaos? And so that's a special burden on all of us to make sure that we have the structures that protect the kind of society that we have. Secondly, and more nuts and bolts, I think of how if one were in a state where there was a private right of action to defend oneself against harms or discrimination, how knowable is the tools that you would need as a litigator, your lawyers would need to be able to go prevail on behalf of your rights. And so I think we have some obstacles, even where states have a private right of action. The ability to get the data one needs to fulfill those values is going to be a challenge. It means that we have to have laws that have the disclosure and the transparency for the information that one would need to be able to protect those rights.
Thank you all so much for today's conversation. I know we're running a few minutes over, so I just wanted to say a final thank you to everyone here, and then everyone joining. This will be up as well as a recording if folks want to distribute it after. But just again, thank you for the conversation, and
Thank
lots
you,
of work
Kristen.
and bills to come.
Thank you,
so
Kristen.
much.
Thank you, Senator and Assemblymember.
Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Zephyr.